Once upon a time in a big city called Lagos, there was a boy named Richard. Richard was 22 years old and went to a very big school called the University of Lagos State. Richard always wore a nose mask. He wore it every day, no matter where he went. At his school, other students noticed Richard's nose mask and thought it was strange. They did not understand why he wore it all the time. Some of them thought he wore it because he was weak or scared of getting sick. This made Richard an easy target for bullying. The bullies would tease Richard and call him names. They would say, "Hey, mask boy. Are you afraid of the air?" and laugh at him. They thought he was weak and they liked to make fun of him. But Richard was not weak at all. He had a secret he was trying to keep. You see, Richard wore the mask to hide his face because something bad had happened in his past. 2 years ago, Richard was at a big event where many people were shouting and waving signs. It was a political rally. But then, something very bad happened. Someone important got hurt very badly, and Richard was blamed for it. Even though Richard did not do it, many people thought he did. They said he was a bad person, and he became a suspect in a murder case. His picture was everywhere, on TV and in newspapers. Richard was very scared. To keep himself safe, he started wearing the nose mask to hide his face. One day, at the University of Lagos State, Richard was sitting in the classroom, listening to his teacher, Professor Adeyemi. Richard liked Professor Adeyemi because she was very kind and smart. She always explained things very well, and Richard learned a lot from her. After class, Richard was walking to the library when he heard some boys laughing behind him. It was Jide and his friends. Jide was the leader of the bullies. He was tall and strong, and he liked to make fun of Richard. "Hey, mask boy. Why do you always wear that mask? Are you afraid of the air?" Jide shouted. Richard tried to ignore them. He just wanted to go to the library and study. But Jide and his friends would not leave him alone. They followed him and kept teasing him. "Take off that mask and show us your face," Jide said, trying to grab Richard's mask. Richard felt very scared, but he did not want to fight. He did not want to cause any trouble. He remembered what happened 2 years ago and wanted to stay out of trouble. He pushed Jide's hand away and ran to the library. Richard found a quiet corner in the library and sat down. His heart was beating very fast. He opened his book and tried to focus on his studies, but it was very hard. He kept thinking about the bullies and what would happen if they found out who he really was. Days went by, and the bullying did not stop. Every day, Jide and his friends would find new ways to tease Richard. They would laugh at him, call him names, and sometimes even push him around. Richard felt very sad and alone, but he did not want to fight back. He just wanted to be left alone and finish his studies. One afternoon, Richard was in the library again, reading a book about political science. He liked learning about how governments worked and how people could make changes in the world. He hoped that one day, he could use what he learned to make things better. Suddenly, he heard loud voices. It was Jide and his friends again. They had followed him to the library. Richard felt a lump in his throat. He did not want any trouble, but he knew they would not leave him alone. "Hey, mask boy. We told you to take off that mask," Jide shouted, walking up to Richard. Richard stood up, trying to stay calm. "Please leave me alone," he said quietly. But Jide did not listen. He reached out and grabbed Richard's mask, pulling it off his face. Everyone in the library turned to look. Richard felt very scared and exposed. He tried to cover his face with his hands, but it was too late. "Look, everyone. It's Richard. The murder suspect," Jide shouted, laughing. Gasps filled the room. People started whispering and pointing. Richard felt tears welling up in his eyes. He wanted to run away and hide, but he could not move. He felt frozen in place. Just then, a familiar voice rang out. "Stop it right now." It was Professor Adeyemi. She walked quickly to where Richard and Jide were standing. She looked very angry. "Leave Richard alone, she said firmly. He has done nothing wrong. But he's a murderer. Jide protested. He was on TV. Everyone knows he did it. No, he did not, Professor Adeyemi said. The charges against Richard were dropped because there was no evidence. He is innocent. Richard looked up at Professor Adeyemi, his eyes filled with gratitude. She was the first person to stand up for him in a long time. He felt a small spark of hope in his heart. Go back to your studies and leave Richard alone, Professor Adeyemi told Jide and his friends. They looked embarrassed and slowly walked away. Professor Adeyemi turned to Richard and smiled kindly. Are you okay, Richard? She asked. Richard nodded, though he still felt shaken. Thank you, Professor, he said softly. You don't need to thank me, she replied. You have the right to be here and study like everyone else. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. Richard felt a warmth in his chest. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged. He decided that he would not let the bullies win. He would show them that he was strong, not weak. The next day, Richard walked into the classroom without his mask. He felt nervous, but he held his head high. He sat down at his desk and waited for class to start. He could feel the other students staring at him, but he did not care. He was ready to face whatever came his way. When Jide and his friends saw Richard without his mask, they looked surprised. They did not say anything at first, but Richard could see the confusion in their eyes. He knew they were not used to seeing him like this. Class began, and Richard focused on Professor Adeyemi's lecture. He listened carefully and took notes, just like he always did. But this time, he felt different. He felt stronger and more confident. After class, Jide approached Richard. Hey, Richard, he said, his voice unsure. Why did you take off your mask? Richard looked at Jide and took a deep breath. Because I'm not afraid anymore, he said. I know I'm innocent, and I won't let you or anyone else make me feel weak. Jide looked taken aback. He did not know what to say. Richard could see that he was thinking about what Professor Adeyemi had said the day before. I'm sorry, Jide said finally. I didn't know. It's okay, Richard replied. Just leave me alone, and let me study in peace. Jide nodded and walked away. Richard felt a sense of relief wash over him. He knew that things would not change overnight, but he had taken the first step towards standing up for himself. In the weeks that followed, Richard noticed a change in the way people treated him. The bullying stopped, and some students even started to talk to him. They asked him about his studies and shared their own experiences. Richard began to feel like he was part of the university community. He also started to participate more in class discussions. He raised his hand to answer questions and shared his thoughts on different topics. Professor Adeyemi often praised his insights, and Richard felt proud of his contributions. One day, Professor Adeyemi asked Richard to stay after class. She wanted to talk to him about a special project. Richard, I think you would be perfect for this, she said, handing him a pamphlet. It's a research project on political systems and social change. I know you have a lot of interest in this area. Richard looked at the pamphlet and felt a surge of excitement. Thank you, Professor, he said. I would love to be part of this project. Great, she replied with a smile. I knew you would be interested. I think you have a lot to contribute. Richard felt a sense of purpose and determination. He knew that he had overcome a lot of challenges, but he was ready to take on new opportunities. He worked hard on the project, putting in long hours at the library and collaborating with other students. Together, they explored different political systems and discussed ways to bring about positive change. As the project progressed, Richard's confidence grew. He realized that he had a voice and that his ideas mattered. He was no longer the boy who hid behind a mask. He was Richard, a bright and capable student who had a lot to offer. The day of the project presentation arrived, and Richard stood in front of his classmates, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement. He took a deep breath and began to speak, sharing his research and ideas. As he spoke, he saw nods of agreement and interest from the audience. He felt a sense of accomplishment and pride. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Professor Adeyemi beamed at him, and Richard knew that he had done well. He had faced his fears and shown everyone that he was not weak. After the presentation, many students came up to Richard to congratulate him and ask questions about his research. He felt a sense of belonging and connection that he had not felt in a long time. As Richard walked home that evening, he thought about how far he had come. He had faced many challenges, but he had not given up. He had found his strength and his voice, and he knew that he could overcome anything that came his way. Richard's journey was not over, but he was ready for whatever the future held. He was no longer afraid. He was confident and determined, ready to make a difference in the world. And so, Richard continued his studies at the University of Lagos State, no longer hiding behind a mask. He knew that he had a bright future ahead of him, filled with opportunities to learn and grow. He had faced his fears and come out stronger, and he was ready to embrace all that life had to offer. Richard's story is a reminder that no matter how tough things may seem, we all have the strength to overcome our challenges. With courage and determination, we can face our fears and find our place in the world. And like Richard, we can make a difference, not only for ourselves but for those around us.